Hello and welcome back to the Nook. I am so glad you're here. Today we're going to talk about this 2-volume set of etiquette books I have from the 1920s. But first of all, I want to tell a little story about these books. While I was doing the research for this video and going through these books, I was just paging through the first volume, and all of a sudden I opened it to a random page, and there was a hairpin, an old-fashioned vintage hairpin, stuck in between the binding of the book here and the pages here. It is not tipped, meaning that there is not rubber put on the little ends of the hairpin. In the late 1940s, tipped hairpins were invented. Well, as this hairpin was not tipped, and I have actually some hairpins from the 1940s around World War II time, and when I compared the two hairpins, they look very similar. So I actually think that that hairpin is from the 1940s. Now let's talk about the 2-volume set of the Book of Etiquette. This book was written by Lillian Eichler. And before we go into the book, I'm just going to give a little bit of background about Miss Eichler. Lillian was born in either 1901 or 1902. She was the daughter of Jewish-Hungarian immigrants who settled in New York City. Lillian grew up in Harlem. Her parents ran a cigar shop, and she and her family lived above the shop. When she was 18 years old in 1918, she decided that she wanted to be in advertising. So she went around New York City to different advertising agencies to try to find a job. She was turned down repeatedly until she went to Ruth, Raff and Ryan Advertising Agency. They were about to turn her down as well, and she asked if they would just take a look at the information and the ideas she had brought with her. Well, they did, and then they hired her on the spot as a copywriter. So how did a woman who was in advertising come to be an author of a set of etiquette books? Well, one of the clients of the agency was Doubleday Publishing, and Doubleday had a problem. They had 1,000 copies of an old etiquette book called the Encyclopedia of Etiquette. It was written by Eleanor Holt. They desperately wanted to move these copies off their shelves. So what did they do? Well, Miss Eichler was asked to create an ad in order to sell the books, and she did, and they flew off the shelves. The only problem was Doubleday Publishing had a return period, and apparently most of the books that sold were returned during that period because the book was written in stiff, rigid, old-style Victorian writing, and the people of the 1920s could not connect with that type of writing. It simply didn't speak to them. So now Doubleday had a new problem: how to sell an etiquette book and have it stay sold. Well, they decided to ask Miss Eichler if she would rewrite the entire book, and that is exactly what she did. And in 1921, at 20 years old, Lillian Eichler officially became an author when the 2-volume set of the Book of Etiquette was published by Doubleday. It sold 2 million copies, and the copies that I have here were printed in 1923. Now that we know a little bit about Lillian Eichler, the author of this book, let's go straight into the etiquette tips from the 1920s that are still relevant today. Tip number 1. It is a well-known truth that manners rather than wealth decide social rank. Now that we've gone through the prim and proper details of our etiquette tip, Let's get to the scandal. Have you ever heard of a Ponzi scheme? That phrase became popular after Charles Ponzi was arrested for fraud in 1920. Charles had conned people out of millions of dollars, paying them returns with money that was invested by other people. So what's the moral of this story? It doesn't really matter how wealthy you are. If you've earned that wealth by conning other people and the public finds out, you are going to be in big trouble, and you might just end up like Charles Ponzi, a former jailbird, divorced, who died penniless in a foreign country. I guess Lillian Eichler was right. Good behavior, manners, and proper etiquette are far more important than wealth. Tip number 2. It is not enough to observe the conventions of society when you are in the elaborate ballroom or at a fashionable dinner. You must be always, at all times, in all places, as courteous and well-mannered as you would be in the most impressive surroundings. The world judges you by your manners in the streetcar and on the avenue, just as severely as it does in private homes and at social functions. Do what is correct because you are well-bred and not because some important person is watching you. Then you will truly be following the rules of courtesy. Jazz-era celebrity Charlie Chaplin became famous for more than just his work on silent films. In his private life, he was married 4 times, divorced 3 times, 2 of those divorces occurring in the 1920s. It is important to note that both his first and second wives were 16 years old when he married them. His 1926 divorce from second wife, Lita Gray, became an incredible scandal. Now, whether or not Charlie was actually guilty of all of the things Lita accused him of, it didn't matter. He still ended up paying an $800,000 settlement, which was the largest settlement in American history at that time. Today, that would be the equivalent of over $14 million. Also, Charlie became known as a man who preyed on young underage women, and his reputation was ruined. It never recovered, and that followed him for the rest of his life. So what's the important thing to learn here? Always have good behavior and manners, good manners, in both your private and your personal life, because there's always someone watching, and your reputation is everything. Have you ever been introduced to someone and you didn't quite catch their name? Maybe you're at a party at a friend's house and there's loud music, or you're in a crowded conference room full of people at a business event. What do? Well, never fear. Miss Eichler has the answer. Tip number 3. Simply smile or nod in acknowledgement and say, "I beg your pardon, I did not catch your name." Or one might say, "I am sorry, but I did not catch the name." Address yourself to the stranger when you wish the name to be repeated, and make your request simply, directly, and with calm dignity. Do not show either by haste or embarrassment that you are ill at ease because the name escaped you. It is one of the secrets of social success, if there can be anything secret about a thing so obvious, to be able to remember names correctly. I think it's a good idea to also know what not to do when you're introduced to someone. But first, let's familiarize ourselves with some 1920s slang. Okay, let's talk about what not to do when you've first been introduced to someone. It's probably not a good idea to point across the room at your ex and say something like this to the person you've just been introduced to. "Hey, do you see that cat over there? I used to have a crush on him, but he is no Dapper Dan. He took me out last weekend. Total flat tire. The man has no clams, he drives a jalopy, and he's a complete corn shredder. Thanks close for that one. So, what lesson did we learn from this? Nothing. But 1920 slang is really fun. Tip number 4. The influence of one's surroundings on one's temper is enormous, though the person may be unconscious of the fact. A disordered room gives a feeling of depression and hopelessness to the one who enters it, while one that is tidy tends to impart a feeling of restfulness. The 1920s was a period of great and rapid change, and this change also influenced how people cleaned. Electricity was becoming much more prominent in homes across the United States, and with this came the invention of new appliances, such as washing machines and vacuum cleaners. Now, speaking of washing machines, clothing styles were changing rapidly too. At this time, we see the invention of the very scandalous flapper dress. A flapper dress was a sleeveless dress with a hem that was raised up to about mid-calf, or even in the later 20s, it would have been below the knee. Now, this was the first time women were really showing their legs in public, so that was a big deal. The dress was also loose and boxy, which allowed a woman to go out in public without wearing a corset. This style of clothing became synonymous with an image of unruly, wild young women who were doing things like smoking cigarettes, dancing to jazz music, and even drinking alcohol. Can you imagine the debaucherous thoughts this style of dress might have put into the heads of young men who had never seen women bare their legs in public before? Oh my. Thanks for joining me today on the Baking Book and History Nook. See you next time. Bye.